customers come in to solace or experience the T.Barnes beauty brand, they're connecting with the fact that we have something to talk about.
For a lifestyle of beauty, we'll give you everything you need. You're a living beauty at T.Barnes Beauty, at T.Barnes Beauty.
So art is one of my greatest passions, and you know, it's interesting that I remember it's just recently that someone called me an artist, and I was like, I don't know if I would consider myself an artist, because I have so many friends that are artists. They're filmmakers, they're singers, you know, they have these very traditional creative outlets that they use, and but what I've recently embraced is that an artist is a creative, and I like to think of myself as a creative, someone who is always trying to create and produce something beautiful. Art is what defines us. It is the mirror to where we are as a society, and sometimes it is the imagined place where we want to be as a society. I don't think I can live without art. I think that our world can't exist without art, without artists, without people that are mirroring our cultural existence or imagining what we could be as human beings together. So, how did you decide I'm an artist? When did that happen for you?
So, I always liked to draw, and I kept a sketchbook, and, occasionally I would take, little classes at the Brooklyn Museum and things like that, and so it was an interest that my parents always encouraged, and my dad would take me to museums in Manhattan, and we would, visit the galleries and talk about art and painting, but I didn't study formally until college. But I don't know. I don't know that I ever, at a certain point, was like, I'm an artist, until I felt like my painting got to a certain point where I felt really confident about it. I always sort of felt like I was a fraud. I was like, I'm an artist, but not really as good as I think, I could be or I should be.
When did that shift happen, and how?
I was actually already teaching college at York, and I was teaching painting classes, and at a certain point I realized that, my level of knowledge could only take my students so far, and I realized I needed to go back and get more education if I was going to really be able to challenge my students and bring them the kinds of technique that was going to improve their painting skill and their ability to be independent of me in a classroom. And so I took classes at the New York Academy in very traditional painting techniques, oil painting, and that's where I really felt like my skills were honed, and I got the confidence to make the kinds of paintings I'm making now and really enjoy it. So it used to be such a struggle. It was sort of like the paintings in my mind didn't ever come out on canvas the way I had imagined them. So now at this point I'm making the work that I imagine.
Tell me about your art, because your art deals with some very specific subject matters. So talk to me about what that is.
My artwork, because my family is very politically active, so there's always a social consciousness in the house, and we always talked about social issues. And when I went to school in St. Louis, it was the first time I had experienced a very segregated city, and where I was really challenged about my racial identity. The fact that I identified myself as a black woman made people really upset, because they didn't immediately identify me as a black woman. And so among the black community, it was like, well, why do you hang out with all these black people? And I'm like, well, because I'm black. and then the white people are like, well, why do you identify as black? And why do you draw all these black people? And I'm like, well, because I'm black. And these are the people that, relate to me. These are my friends and my family members. Why do you draw so many white people, right? Because you're white, and that's your experience, and that's those are the people you're trying to communicate with. And so it was constantly a challenge about, who's my audience? Black people don't buy artwork, so who are you trying to talk to? And it was the first time I had experienced an Aunt Jemima doll, like a mammy cookie jar in a store. That
For sale.
For sale. That also had like Confederate flags in there and sort of celebrating, the Confederate side of the war. And I thought this is a really, this to me is really curious. How do I deal with this constructed imagery of what Black femininity is, made by white culture to romanticize a slave history that I reject as, how I view myself or the women around me and their femininity and their Black womanhood. And so I started making a lot of work about these Black collectible images, and they were really angry pieces. And it was also the time of, O.J. Simpson trial was going on, and so Black men were seen as this threat. And when I was making work, it was always about race, even if it was just a portrait of a friend. Because it was a Black friend, it became about race, and it became about some sort of political agenda. And then I had a conversation with Jay Singleton, who still is the fashion design, head of the fashion design program at Washington University. And he's originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, same town as my mother. And he would make these beautiful mammy drawings, and he would call them his mammies. And he said, my mother was a domestic. My grandmother was a domestic. And these were women who were proud, beautiful Black women who supported their family by taking care of other people's children. And so he's like, I don't see mammies as a bad thing. I see them as actual women and actual people. And so, I don't allow this cookie jar image to define what my mother was to me or my grandmother was to me. And so that really transformed how I saw them. And so I started thinking about how to make the work more personally engaged with my own conversation about Blackness and femininity. And so I started to use the topsy-turvy doll as that metaphor for the dichotomy between how I viewed myself and how the world saw me. And so a lot of the images have, maybe, myself as a light-skinned woman on one side and a darker-skinned woman on the other. Because for me, I always wanted to be more obviously Black, so people would stop questioning my self-identification as an African-American woman. But on the other hand, it's, my last name is Buxenbaum. My father is Jewish American. And so, now when I make this work and people meet me, the conversation happens naturally because I make work about Black people. My last name is Jewish. I look the way I look. And I think it's a really interesting conversation about the diversity of Blackness.
So what is Blackness to you?
I think Blackness is about culture. It's about affinity. It's about, the American experience.
So I know you do this, you have 2 kids, you have a husband, and what's the reality of trying to create, being a mother, being an artist, being a wife to someone, and having to balance what the perceived responsibilities are of all those things?
I've had to be very forceful about carving out time for myself and having some boundaries about having an artistic space that is my space to make my work, and time to do that. And because my paintings are very time consuming, I need large chunks of time. And so it was definitely a struggle when the kids were younger and much more dependent, and I had to kind of put painting on hold. I did some small drawings and things like that, but I wasn't making work at the rate I would have liked to. But I think as women, we don't often advocate for the things that we need, especially in terms of our professional careers.
What's freedom to you? Do you feel free?
Some days I do. Some days I don't. I mean, I do because I feel like I'm doing exactly what I want to do. I enjoy teaching. I enjoy having a family and having kids. I enjoy making my artwork.
So what would you say your greatest challenge was with living the life that you've envisioned for yourself?
There are financial constraints to being an artist. mean, art materials are expensive. And, you know, having a career that really allows me to make work is challenging. I think making the choice to go into teaching college was the best possible choice for me, because teaching at the university or college level, you know, it's a given that they expect you to make your work. And so my teaching load is such that I have days to work on my studio practice. But most of the artists I know, unless they, you know, have a gallery that's representing them and, you know, sort of helping them pay their bills, and they're not making art anymore. So being an educator has allowed me to continue making artwork, you know, the way that I want to. My name is Nina Buxenbaum, and I'm Living Beauty.